Hello, world of YouTube, and welcome to the Ghostface Killah Discography Review DX. Ghostface Killah is really the one member of the Wu-Tang Clan whose discography I have the most interest in talking about, even if he's not maybe my favorite member of the group. I think that he easily has the most interesting discography for how he not only carved out his own real pocket within the Wu-Tang style ephemera and really leaning into the group before you really carving out a path on his own. I think that he did a good job at expanding on some of the ideas he contributed to the group and having an interesting balance of coke bars with just super sensual shit, while having some interesting deviations that really lend to showing off a love of creativity that I like seeing him expand upon. That said, not all of these albums are bangers. There are some records that I do not enjoy from Ghostface's stacked catalog. However, those records really are overshadowed by the quality here. He is a rapper that people do regard as not only the best member of Wu-Tang Clan, but their personal favorite rapper, and it's easy to see why. He's an artist that very much, when he locks in, can just make a classic with a well-constructed vision. One of the things interesting about his discography is not only how those moments do happen, but how they're juxtaposed with these records that feel very much like autopilot. And it's interesting to see an artist who goes to some interesting creative worlds have an autopilot, and what does autopilot really feels like, because they do not only lend to the overwhelming decent part of his discography, they do lend to some of the weaker components that, again, I'll be ranking worst to best. And starting with that ranking, we are going to put the sole album that's in the F tier in the tier list, and that is 2019's Ghostface Killah's. It's really on the nose construction. I think that the feature list, while on paper pretty nice, I think everybody here sounds like they're coming in just the sleepiest mood, delivering some of the most monotonic bars in their career, with a lot of old head tone deafness also just really coating a lot of the record. There's a real underlying feeling of just disgust in this that doesn't really lean into the hardcore hip-hop kind of disgust that is felt on some of the more raw, aggressive sides of Ghostface discography, and more just have the feeling of a condescending old person just getting all their deep-seated hatred out in the ugliest way. And it makes for just an ugly listen. It's a record that I did not spin when it came out, even though I was reviewing Ghostface Killah records in 2019. I remember talking about this Czarface Ghostface record, but I missed this, and I don't think I missed out on a whole lot. If this creative group were making a record, which, I guess they were making records to some capacity together 20 years ago, they would have made some real heat. But I think that this, pocket project, nondescript idea of a record that is this leads to easily Ghostface's worst record. Again, I don't really dig the bars. I don't really dig the features. Capadonna has never sounded worse, in my opinion. But I also think that Method Man on the track he's on, he literally sounds like he woke up 20 minutes ago and got on the mic and just started saying bars. And sure, it sounds smooth, but it also just sounds sleepy as hell. I think if you had missed this record when it came out, you didn't miss much, and you don't really owe it to yourself to listen to it, because again, it's just overly bitter and hateful, and the production isn't anything special. There's some moments where there's some ideas that could flourish out or could have been utilized a little more interestingly, like on Flex, but I think that by even some of the production just sounds like the worst attempts at recapturing the magic of records like Fish Scale, or even Supreme Clientele or Iron Man a little bit, but more this feels like it's trying to tap into like the fish scale era and just flopping whole stop. Now, while we are leaving the F tier, we're going to be staying in current Ghostface Killah while we shift to the E tier, because I think that I think Ghostface is in a bit of a creative downswing. He's not really pulling together anything that I think fits a vision that's all that interesting. And what I think makes his most recent album, as of making the Supreme Clientele 2, all the more disappointing is that it's supposed to be like a follow-up to what's regarded as not only one of the best Wu-Tang solo albums, which is an opinion that I share, but that it's one of the best like rap albums of all time. I really like Supreme Clientele. I wouldn't put it amongst my top 25 rap albums of all time. I probably would rank somewhere in maybe my top 50. But Supreme Clientele 2 is regardless like what feels like the straight to DVD sequel to what was like a blockbuster classic that just really fails at trying to recapture any magic that was on that original. I remember when it came out, there were like lots of shots thrown at the sampling and some of the beat production, and I don't think it's all that far off. The quality of production is relatively inconsistent. A lot of the utilizations on features, which are stacked on paper, don't really do anything here. This is the kind of like direct-to-DVD sequel that like Ghostface isn't even played by Ghostface in the real film, you know, sort of comparisons going on. It's just a very lazy, shoddy attempt at reworking and reinterpolating a classic. It's also a record that feels like it's trying to fly through all of its ideas on top of having features that feel underutilized. It's just a record that feels oddly rushed for something that I feel like at least Ghostface had to have been hyping up for a while at this point. The storytelling that happens on Curtis May and Fourth Disciple, and through some of the very just like still basic ideas on Rap Kingpin, have moments where they seem like glimmers into that golden era, but I just think that they're over all too quickly. I really can't think of a time where Ghostface and Nas worked together prior to Love Me Anymore, but if you'd have told me that it worked together on a sequel to Supreme Clientele like 10 years ago, I'd have been pretty stoked. And, like, especially considering Nas is on a hot streak, it's unfortunate to see a collaboration that sounds, like, insanely good, just sounding like pissing in the wind. I talked about it in my original review, but I still think it's crazy that both the GZA and Redman feel wasted on this record. While I said I liked this album more than Supreme Clientele 2 in my review of Supreme Clientele 2, and I would say that opinion still stands, it's still not really by that much, especially in the grand scheme of the Ghostface discography. So Set the Tone, Guns N' Roses is also going in the E slot. It's a record that, admittedly, I do not respin when it comes to wanting to respin Ghostface Killah projects. I have respun it a couple of times, especially when last year when I was spinning for Supreme Clientele 2, I really wanted to know where I sat between the two because they were the two most recent records of his. And I think that there's an interesting attempt at branching out and modernizing that happens on here that sits starkly, not really in a good way, but like against some of the nostalgia chasing that it still feels like he's trying to reinvent on here. But on top of just some like, again, tracks like that, tracks that just hit subjects that just sound wild for a rapper in his 50s to really be going in on, like on Plan B. The overabundance of Harley on here, I just don't think suits Ghostface all that well. He's a guy that Ghostface really seems to want to work with lately, and it's cool that he's got someone new to fit in his creative circle. I just don't think that the two always come together with a track that is all that great. There's also moments where he tries to, what I feel like, reinvent the fish scale era again that happened throughout like Killah in the Safe, through Plan B in some spots. Some of the skits that happen and all that really feel like they're trying to like hit that golden era Ghostface reinvention in other ways that I just think don't culminate in anything that works or just like sounds all that interesting when standing against those things he's trying to reinvent. And I don't know. This record, at the end of the day, while better than Supreme Clientele 2 for sure. Still, again, just doesn't touch a lot of what's up here, in my opinion. I do think it's interesting where Czarface Ghostface is going to end up compared to everything that's come after it. But there are also records that I like less than that are up here. But like this in particular, this era in particular, just has Ghostface wearing a bunch of different faces that feel familiar, but different in ways that don't work. And that's, I feel like this era is definitely time for Ghostface that I don't think people really need to dive all that deeply into, in my opinion. I feel like he's got so many other records you could listen to before this. He's got so many records that have more interesting stages that they set, more consistent vibes that they sit in, better production, the creative circles that he works with, I feel like just kind of fire off in better cylinders throughout a lot of this. And while there is one more project I'm going to put in the E tier, these three I definitely think stand out as Ghostface's worst. And I don't know if that's really all that surprising at the end of the day to a lot of people. I don't know how many people really listen to a lot of current Ghostface. He's an artist that I feel like a lot of people get more nostalgic for than anything else and really respin those classics. But I feel like for a while he was still just keeping it consistent. And you guys, and like while there are some, again, relative okay records that I'll be talking about coming up, there's still some stuff that dropped in the last like 15 years that I think lands among this crop, if not this crop. Like, he's just a really interesting rapper. That said, his Christmas EP isn't really all that crazy either. I don't think that like Christmas music or Christmas artists doing Christmas records is like inherently a bad idea. And I think Ghostface doing a Christmas album is kind of funny. I think that it's a kind of funny idea, but I don't think that like it actually reaches a funny level. And honestly, when I saw that he did a Christmas EP, I knew I was going to want to talk about it because I wanted to know what a Ghostface Killah Christmas thing sounded like. And like, yeah, it's got a good start. The first track, about robbing Santa Claus or being up in Santa Claus's house, doing crazy stuff, is a great concept. And I think Ghostface Killah is like a rapper that could wear that well, especially considering some of the creative places he's gone while embracing like the Tony Stark's persona. And I think that like there's some other things that like try to tap into like a different vibe adjacent to Christmas, but I don't think are culminate to anything that like I think makes for something you really gotta spin. Every track, at least on the YouTube uploads of the EP2, are like extended cuts. And I don't know if that's how it is on the EP because it is an extended play, but like I could use with just like tighter songs because the beats aren't that interesting enough to go on for like measures with nothing else going on. But it's not like, it doesn't feel like Ghostface trying to put a hat on a hat or like change the way he's wearing a hat. It's him doing something different, and I like that about it. I don't know. I feel like he could have really gone funnier with it personally. That said, that's the end of the E tier. Again, I feel like Ghostface should be a benchmark with which artists should ascertain for when crafting solo discographies if they're a part of a group, because sure, it's prolific, but like he comes with vision. He has eras. He has like interesting collaborators that he has one-offs with. And while I won't necessarily like the records that we're going to talk about in the next tier, the step from these to this is at least like a notch more than like just a one letter shift, in my opinion. Like, while these records leave a poor taste in my mouth at the end of the day, what we're going to be going into are records that leave like a very nondescript taste in my mouth. They're records that don't excite the palate as a whole, but have moments that sure maybe stick out here and there. And there's maybe one record that I think does that the most out of this entire discography. That's Woo Block. It was a record that was supposed to be a bringing together of Wu-Tang and D-Block. It was supposed to be like a more collaborative circle, but I guess only Ghostface and Sheek Louch really showed up for practice. So the two of them while having other members of the groups come together, created this experience that tries to meld these vibes and really give a good New York supergroup. Something that would happen later on in the decade, interestingly enough, but to a little more of a consistent success. But I do think that what this record needs at the end of the day are more Raekwon and more Jadakiss. I know Capadonna was also supposed to be a part of this, and I think he does have some great bars on here, but I feel like Ghostface and Jadakiss should have been on more tracks together. There's a track on the Pretty Tony album Run that I think is really good with the two of them together, and I think that, like, again, when they come together on here, like on the intro or on All In Together, like they just have good chemistry together, and I think that the two of them could thrive. And those tracks in particular also are these posse cuts. You know, Styles P comes in and All In Together, and Raekwon comes in on the intro, and I think Raekwon just needs to pop up more because he is my favorite Wu-Tang member, and I think that he works well with Ghostface. I also think he would chop it up nicely with Jadakiss. What I think is the most disheartening is that I can see the vision. And I think the production palette on here is solid enough that it really complements the mood of this project decently enough. But, like, there's just some parts where it feels like there could be more going on. You know, I like Take Notice, but it feels kind of sparse. And I feel like Cocaine Central, missing Raekwon and Jadakiss, feels like a real shame. I think the moments where it does mellow out, like on Driving Round, do also add a nice different pivot in style that I think works well, and also has other collaborators in the pot that are good, but it just doesn't shine the brightest, the most consistently across track listing. It is a record that is fine, it is solid, but also, again, if we're comparing Ghostface records, lands low, because if you followed Ghostface before this, you could see him be able to tell the story on a record. And this could have been a better story. And I think that's its biggest disappointment to me personally. It is not a record that I also spun before doing this discography review. It's one that I knew existed, but it's one that I always passed on because I saw, like, moderate reception for it, and I think that it's very apt. Another collaboration that I feel like could have gone farther, considering where they went together after this collaboratively, is the collab record he did with Trife the God, Put It On The Line, that I'm also putting in the D tier. This was a collab record where we see the two of them trading tracks, both of which feel very much like the most idiosyncratic versions of those rappers, considering what they were cooking together on records like Fish Scale after this, and some of the collabs that pop up on, like, the Big Doe Rehab and such. He's just a collaborator that once Ghostface really dug the vibes up, he worked with for a while. And I think that this is, like, a fine enough introduction of those worlds more consistently together, but ultimately sets a stage for them to run with in ways that I think are more interesting. That said, again, the songs aren't necessarily bad. They're just kind of, like, mediocre in the pantheon of Ghostface discography especially. It's a project that, again, I hadn't spun until looking into his discography and seeing that he did a collab, and considering how much I like his collabs with Trife the God and what they did after this, I wasn't let down, but, like, I'm not going to miss this album when I leave it in the rear view is all I'm going to say. Now, because this is early on in both of these rappers' careers, their comfort zone is something that they can thrive in more than just ride for nostalgia's sake. So tracks like Hustle Hard and Put It On The Line, and Cocaine Trafficking are, like, bangers. They're just not as interesting bangers as what would come on down the line, like I've said. It's a solid foundation. And I think that if you like these two rappers, you'll find some tracks that you like in it. But again, in comparison to what I'll be talking about, there's just a better hit ratio, I guess, or a more exciting hit ratio. Because it's not that it fails, it just doesn't land in anywhere that I'll regret leaving in the rear view as a whole. This is going to possibly be the first contentious pick of any record I'll talk about in this, because it was released amidst, like, a prolific era where Ghostface was shining. But to me, it feels like a record of Ghostface caught in transition and resting on his laurels worse than he'd ever had, because it felt like the first point in his career where he had laurels that he could rest on, considering the trajectory of his career saw him mostly just evolving and adapting into interesting worlds. I'm talking about 2007's The Big Doe Rehab. It's a record that, admittedly, I really hadn't listened to prior to this ranking. While I've talked the fuck up about the Fish Scale era, I also knew the Ghostini era prior to this, but every time I looked at the Big Doe Rehab's cover, it was giving, like, I've got to recreate the Bulletproof Wallets era. And while it's not going to be in the D tier, because this is the last album I'm putting in the D tier, Bulletproof Wallets isn't going to rank high amongst the rest of Ghostface discography. And while Ghostface is working with the same creative circle that he was with Fish Scale, there's some stuff with Trife to God and the Theater Unit. There's stuff with Wu-Tang members. There's like a little sort of cross promotion posse cut in the middle of the record with Paisley Darts that I think is like fine. But the overall sheen of this record just doesn't have the same worldliness or like just really well blended style that was seen throughout the Fish Scale era or Ghostini and what would happen around this time. It's a record that I don't necessarily regret spinning, because it is Ghostface resting on his laurels for the first time, and like he doesn't do it all that badly. I enjoy the production on a track like Yolanda's House, and I think that like out of the pantheon of collabs between Raekwon, Ghostface, and Method Man, they've done worse. They've done better, but they've done worse. And Rec Room Therapy is another banger, too. I like seeing You God shine, and he seems to shine the brightest on Ghostface records, and I think that that's another moment where I feel like he kind of does. I think I just also prefer Ghostface when he comes with a collective vision on a project, as you'll see. And again, I feel like Big Doe Rehab just feels like it's trying to rework a vibe where he felt like he was in a world of conflict, and maybe he was at this point. It's a record that maybe feels conflicted, but what it's between is easily a notch better at the very least, and that's going to be what I round the D tier out with. We're going to start the C tier with a threshold record. It's a record that could very much have ended up in the D tier if it were worse. It's firmly a C tier album. It's firmly an album that like is solid enough that it warrants being in that tier, but like if this Wu Massacre album were any worse, especially for how much better it could be, it would be like this. It'd be a Wu Block scenario, man. Like Wu Block is to me what Wu Massacre is what Wu Block could have felt like if there were just like more cooks in the kitchen at more times. But like this record is more just feel like it's fighting itself because it's got some quality shit. I listened to this album when it came out. I did an alternate take review on this album like a couple of years ago for a Woobruary. I think this album is like worth spinning, to be honest. Even though it's got problems, even though it's way too short, even though these songs fly the fuck by, and the production is a mess as far as like the actual like the mixing goes. It's a bit of a mess because the beats are fine. There's some pretty solid beats here, but like they have some really good chemistry on here. It's a solid ass album. It's just a record I've always wanted more from. If they would just follow this up, I would love this. Hell, do like a Wu Massacre Czarface collab record. Have some fun with it. I don't know. I will always go to bat for Wu Massacre as being solid, but nothing more. Nothing less, but nothing more. It is an album that I think has some fun sequels. Like there's a Meth vs. Chef sequel on here. There's like a Criminology sequel. There's a fun track with Inspector Deck and Sun God that I think is good. I dig Dangerous. That's a really good song. I used to spin the fuck out of that when I was in college. Like it was very much on rotation because I like the beat. I don't know. It's a record that I would recommend to people if they want just like a brief little vibe in Wu-Tang Town. it's chill. It is the most 6 out of 10 release in Ghostface discography. It is the absolute center of Ghostface discography. Everything above this is like at least solid. It's at least solid. But if not a little kind of, spotty. But yeah, this is, and it's this for all three of these rappers. It is the most 6 out of 10 Method Man record. It is the most 6 out of 10 Raekwon record, because they're all throwing in equal parts. It's just, all right, that's it. The next record I'm going to put in the C tier is not much farther above that. In fact, the next couple of records are not. But I'm going to put 36 Seasons in there. It is the most 6 out of 10 strictly Ghostface record. It is a record that tries to sort of like stay in the same world as a record like 12 Reasons to Die, but doesn't have a framework like that record that keeps it feel like it's going somewhere. It's a solid record that I admittedly did not spin when it came out. It is one of those records that completely missed me, and I spun for the review. But, like, leaving it behind, like, there are some tracks that I do enjoy here, and I dig that, like, the collaborative pot here does feel like at least somewhat building around something. Is just a bit more ambiguous, or at least like a little less direct than records like 12 Reasons to Die or Ghost Dini or even Pretty Tony. And like, but I dig what's going on here, especially sonically. I dig the production. I think that it does feel like it has a good pairing to Ghostface voice and just bar spinning style, especially when he tries to really get reflective on pockets of this. It's a record where he tries to make his I'm a vet now record. Like, it's very much a record that feels like trying to extend his sort of pen into different worlds, and I think it does so pretty solidly. There's a lot of the bars that sort of allude to it being a continuation from 12 Reasons to Die, which is interesting considering 12 Reasons to Die has a sequel already. But, like, as far as keeping this spirit of, like, being this aged, like, ancient killer returning home after being resurrected, I mean, it's got an interesting vision in that regard, but I wouldn't say it quite goes as hard as 12 Reasons to Die. And I think it's because this record just has it has a comic book, obviously, but I think there's more to it behind the scenes that ultimately I think lends to its sequel's follies, because it doesn't by comparison live up to it. But I feel like even under the light of it being a sequel to this, it's a sequel in vibes. It's a sequel in spirit, but there's a lot about it that feels very dissected, and it's possibly because it just doesn't have a place to take this character. It's more just a contemplative sequel, less so a narrative sequel. It's cool to see him also have Cool G Rap in his circle. I think Cool G Rap is an interesting rapper as far as how he pulls bars together, and I think he's an interesting pairing to Ghostface in particular. The collaboration with Fairmont is also pretty fun. Again, it's a pretty solid ass record. It is the most 6 out of 10 purely because it's just a record of vibes. The vibes are solid, but especially considering he at least tries to do a sequel, even if and I'm putting it next in the ranking, it doesn't necessarily take the narrative somewhere that I think is all that interesting. I at least enjoy its attempt, but it is a record that I did spin when it came out and was also kind of disappointed. While I appreciate that it does try to strike the same balance of bringing the listener along the story and weaving the Ghostface POV with the other members of Wu-Tang and collaborators while progressing the story, I just don't think that the execution is as interesting. It was because I don't think it got a comic. It was just a record in pure presentation, and it's a solid record. It is something that I think skirts the line of a 6 or a 7. It is a very, very decent extension of this War of the DeLucas story from the first from the first album. And I think that like some of the new collaborators bring some cool stuff. I love the Vince Staples collab on here. I think Scarab does a cool like pop up on here and acts as sort of like a second character in this story. Obviously, I love seeing Raekwon. I think it's interesting to have RZA continue to be like a narrator through this, and it very much feels like they're trying to give it that same attention to detail. I just don't like it as much. It's a solid album. I think that it is a record that if you enjoy 12 Reasons to Die, you'll enjoy this. Same with 36 Seasons. I think that it is like an interesting sequel of sorts. They both are. I just think that the original is a choice story album frame that Ghostface made, but I'll talk about that in due time. Another album that was released around this time that I think is a really, really solid album in his discography are the Lost Tapes, a sort of companion, or a sort of like compilation style batch of songs with this sandwich of, unfortunately, Michael Rappaport, creating this vibe of just pure New York bars with a little West Coast middle that I think creates for a really fun listen. There's a lot of heat. There's a lot of really good tracks and collaborations in here. As far as Melting Pots and Ghostface catalog, as far as being the most on the nose, but like doing an okay job at that, this might be that. Like, of course the Killah Priest song sounds like this. Of course the track with Benny the Butcher has this style of production. There is an intro to the Wu-Tang collab that has a look back on Cream. Of course it does. The West Coast song has Snoop Dogg and E40. Sure, why not? And it's a banger. There's a lot of like really good ideas here. It is just probably the most on the nose Ghostface album, but that kind of feels like the point. And it's a solid version of that. But that's because Ghostface is a very solid rapper at the end of the day. I obviously don't love every song, or else it would be higher. But as far as a record that you can't really go wrong with, and I would assume just like these albums, you'd walk away pulling away some gems. This has got that. It's not a starting point by any means, but I think that it is at least an interesting dive. That little list of bands that he does at the beginning of I Think I Saw a Ghost is a wild way to start a verse, in my opinion. But that track is another fun little tangent that pops up near the end that I think makes for a nice little flashy closer. But yeah, this record's solid. It's got a framework amidst its compilation feel, but like I dig the framework a lot, which is kind of the core part of what makes for a good Ghostface album. Because this is going to close out the C tier. No, I've got one more. I've got a Threshold album that I'm going to put in the C tier. But as far as like records in Ghostface discography that are easily the most solid and like with a hit ratio that I think, I guess, embodies this era of his career, considering that like these all kind of came out around the same time with a few exceptions. You can't go wrong, but you could definitely go better. Now, as far as the last album I'm going to put in the C tier, and the highest risk, high reward I feel he's achieved in his discography, as far as not flopping, it's the Pretty Tony album, at least not wholly flopping. This may seem contentious. I don't really know how people feel about some of his discography, this album included. It is an album that where Ghostface tries to lean more into sensual jams, sexy jams, hot jams about fucking. There's a real romantic swagger of this that like he dips into. I don't think he wholly fails at doing, but like there's some moments, like on one of the earlier tracks, Biscuits, where he tries to handle more like singing style songwriting, and I just don't think it hits as well as like I would say maybe a rapper that he would know like Method Man would do. I think that Method Man has a better approach to melody. But I think Ghostface putting it all out there is bold. And I don't think wholly fails. I don't think it's a record that I have ever really enjoyed spinning in full. But I dig the vibes. I dig some of the vibes. I don't think that, like, the bathtub skit has ever been my vibe, but I'm like that with most skits in hip-hop. I think that sometimes they're fun, but sometimes they just don't hit. And I think that some of the skits on here, great example of that. But, like, it's fun in some fun ways. That Tush song, it could be worse. It's a fine enough record. It's something that, like, felt like a risk for Ghostface. And I don't think Holy fails. But again, it's not sitting any higher. I'd call it a threshold, but it's a threshold that lands below. And doesn't sit above where it could be. But it could be much lower. He really strikes a good balance on here. Now, as far as threshold albums that do sit above similarly to Wu Massacre, we're going to enter the B tier with a record similar to the Pretty Tony album, but I think is a little more interesting with this concept and sees Ghostface evolving from the Pretty Tony album solidly with Ghostini, a record that I enjoy. I go back and forth with this album. It's not an album that I ever really want to spin in full, but I think it's because I don't necessarily always dig, and I think it's why I don't spin Pretty Tony in full as much, because, like, I don't wholly dig Ghostface trying to, like, go on these sex odysseys, I guess. I think his other excursions he's done are just more interesting. But Ghostini is an interesting record at the end of the day. It's just like it's a very weird it's a very weird tangent for him to want to go on. I dig it though. Like when I was respinning it for this review, I was reminded like, no, I do kind of like Ghostini. It's not like it's not like he's gone on more interesting worlds that like I think are kind of neat, but like this has got a cool vision that I can appreciate. And I dig a lot of the hands in the pot. Like, I think it's smart for him to do a track with John Legend. I think Sharifa is a good choice to start the record off on, as far as, like, R&B singers adding a good melody beneath his hard-hitting bars. I think Lloyd... I've never wholly hated Lloyd's style, and I think that he works well on here. Obviously, Neo coming back makes a lot of sense, hot off of back like that. But it is more than just that more use of R&B singers and pivoting the way he handles melody, like on tracks like Stapleton Sex, that elevate this record. It's the lack of skits and focus on just painting a more vivid portrait amidst that framework built around the relationship that this album is indebted to or dedicated, inspired by, that I think elevates it above a record like Pretty Tony. Pretty Tony was like a proof of concept. You know, he was toying with stuff on like Bulletproof Wallets and the worlds of like more melody play and R&B inspo, but like this was like the real odyssey within some like fantastical imagery that I think helps enhance those R&B lovey vibes that I really enjoy about this album at the end of the day. You know, again, I'd rather spin it in full over a record like Pretty Tony, or even some days Bulletproof Wallets, showing evolution and really conceptualizing. I really appreciate that about it. So it's introducing the B tier. One project I really wish got to have its full-length treatment was The Meeting of the Worlds, that was Ghostface Killah and MF Doom Starks. I feel like the closest thing we'll ever get to that now in this world is this Czarface meets Ghostface record, which I think I thought it was really solid when it came out, and upon reflection, I think it is still a really, really solid album. You know, it is crazy to me that the guys in Czarface got to do not only 2 collab albums with Doom, but this album with Ghostface, and somehow we didn't get a Doom Starks meets Ghostface or Czarface, or like versus Czarface type record, because it feels like it was sitting in front of us this whole time. And at some point now, I feel like I've got to do a Czarface discography review, right? Because they were in this video, they were in my Doom discography review, but I digress. The Czarface meets Ghostface album is like an interesting slice of Ghostface discography nonetheless, and works well as a Ghostface record as much as it does a Czarface record, considering how the frame is built, so to speak, the framework of the album. You know, it very much feels like an issue of a comic, kind of like a Czarface record, but that presentation style still works. Even if it is a bit light in like the skit department, the transitions across tracks and the sequencing lend themselves very well to a similar type of artistry. And that's what I think really is magical about how Ghostface records can really feel. But like, it's got a good over-the-top style that it leads the album off on, with some action and like Face Off and Iron Claw. I think Zarcade 87 is a really good song that I do wish had a little more going on. It's an example of like, this album gives a lot, but sometimes pulls back in ways that I think are kind of interesting. Powers and Stuff, though, is a really fun single that feels like, again, really amplifies that animated cartoon comic book edge really brightly. I think that Morning Ritual feels like the intro to a comic issue, juxtaposing the mornings of the members of Czarface and Ghostface. I feel like it really taps into like a seedier side that Ghostface wants to channel in this persona. It's kind of interesting to me that he didn't go under the Tony Stark's banner, but maybe there was like an issue with that. That's nerd stuff aside, I do think that like that goes well into Super Soldier Serum, though the sequencing on this record is really choice. There's just some tracks that I wish had a little more going on, but this is a really, really solid, fun album that I do like spinning, and I will see myself revisiting parts of at least, and adding into keeping in my rotation, you know, re-adding, recirculating into my rotation. It's one of those that I feel like if you've enjoyed like the stuff that Czarface have done in the past and you never listened to this, it's cool, if only because like Inspectah Deck and Ghostface here have a different kind of vibe paired with Inspectah Deck doing the Czarface shtick. It's a really fun record that I think is dope as fuck. And I feel like if you aren't a fan of like just the all-out visceral bars, they don't sound appealing to you by Ghostface, give this a try, because it's got like an animated version of Ghostface style before dipping into records like Iron Man or Supreme Clientele that I like a lot more than this, and that I feel like a lot of people like more than this. It's also just kind of an interesting thing to think about for me, considering this is the last Ghostface album I've liked, and it's 6 years old. I really hope he does more stuff with Czarface at least, because this is really fun. And I feel like if they could make 2 bangers with Doom, why not make another banger with Ghostface? While I'm putting stuff in the B tier, I'll go ahead and put an album that I think is his best transitional album, but still like less focused in concept in a way that sets it back for me. And that's Bulletproof Wallets. Bulletproof Wallets is a fine record in his discography. Clearly, it's above all of this stuff. But even in that spirit, even in that breath, I'd probably spend 36 Seasons in Moo Massacre more so over this. And it's partially because, like, unlike these, which are just solid frameworks with a good through line, this just has more just a sonic cohesion while Ghostface figures out how he wants to experiment with ideas, distancing himself from, like, Wu-Tang strictly. And I think that, like, the results, while maybe a relative mixed bag, are less of a mixed bag than, like, Big Doe Rehab. I think that, like, there's a real back and forth in the tone, but that elegance in the production and that consistency in that is what helps unify those in a way that I think makes it better. And also the beat selection is just better on Bulletproof Wallets by and large. And we have Ghostface like in his early prime, so the bars are also just potently better. I think that like the way he taps into, like he really leans more into that like love of women and the relationship drama, I feel like more so on this, but I think it helps sell that pivot more so. Like, sure, it goes a bit off the deep end, while I think Never Be the Same does a good job at doing this very back and forth dialogue and gets to the nitty gritty of the problems. It kind of goes off the deep end throughout the Teddy skit into Theodore, one of the few songs where Ghostface really starts to introduce more singing into his style, something that obviously would lead to something like the Pretty Tony album, but like it isn't as much of a thing on here. It's very much still like he's testing the waters. There's a lot of testing the waters. It feels like the spirit of bulletproof wallets, but he just tests the waters pretty solidly here. I'd honestly, I mean, I'd probably also spin Ghostini and Czarface meets Ghostface over bulletproof wallets at the end of the day, but where these have an interesting frame that he just doesn't do maybe enough with sometimes. This is just a frameless dip into something neat. You see him work with artists like Trife and Killah more, who would help shape the identity of his projects after this point more so, especially throughout records like Fish Scale and More Fish. I think that like Strawberry really lights a fire in the track listing and helps bring back the listener into that sort of more aggressive driven tone really well. I think that Killison's verse on there is crazy. And I think that like there's a solid batch of ideas here. It's just not as good as the stuff I'm going to rank above it, because this is going to be the last album in the B tier. Actually, I lied. I'm going to put one more album in the B tier before we get into my top 6 Ghostface Killah albums. And to round out the B tier, I'm going to do an album that I've been regarding as higher than I probably should, but I'll call it a what did I call fringe? What are the borderline records? Like threshold albums, like ones that could be A, could be B, but at the end of the day, it does kind of feel like more a series of like B-sides and offcuts. And I'm talking about More Fish, the collection of tracks that dropped shortly after Fish Scale dropped. And I mean, it really just shows how stacked this era was for him, because I mean, there are some really good songs in this track listings and some other oddities that also crop up in the back end, but it's got like the pacing of like a compilation album, which for an album, you know, like Fish Scale that kind of has a cinematic scope, it is kind of interesting to see like a B-sides collection just for that. That said, the highs, I mean, a lot of the stuff I put in my redacted of Fish Scale that I did a couple of years ago, but Guns N' Razors is like really great song that has that doom production that just makes for a really interesting pseudo cartoonish backbeat. It feels like something that could end up on like a Czarface record, and I absolutely love that. I think that Josephine is like an interesting way for him to do like this type of slow jam about a woman, but I enjoyed it enough to put it on there. Obviously, I think Stolen Script is really good. I love the remix of You Know I'm No Good, the Amy Winehouse track. It is in the version of Back to Black that I have on vinyl, so it's something that I like having, because I think that like it's a cool collaboration. And there's other songs I didn't put in my redacted that could have ended up on there, like Miguel Sanchez or Blue Armor. But by and large, there are just more of like a scattershot of solid jams outside of some of the highlights. This very much feels like a cherry-picking experience, and if I'm putting other cherry-picking experiences, like the Czarface meets Ghostface or the Bulletproof Wallets in the B tier, I've got to put More Fish in here. Plus, I get a clean layout for my top 6. I'm going to have 3 in A and 3 in S, so for sort of sake of the vibes, we're gonna get into that top 6, starting with easily the least, I don't want to say least conceptual, but kind of least conceptual of all of these records, and that's Apollo Kids. Apollo Kids is a great album. It shares production problems I have, like Woo Massacre, but the hit ratio on it is so fucking good, I just don't care. Like, as far as utilizing the features, something that I've complained about just in some of the lowest points on here, everybody in this melting pot brings some solid shit to the table. Brings some great shit to the table in certain instances. I really love the opening with GZA and Killah Priest. I think it sets a really good stage that this album is going to get nostalgic for Ghostface roots in ways that he hadn't really been dipping into over the last handful of years. And I think it's a really nice reintroduction to Wu-Tang Ghostface Killah. While also just having a love of other East Coast beasts, stepping up and lending some good collaborations. You know, he tries to chop it up with a chopper flow with Busta Rhymes on Superstar, which I think is an interesting vibe, but I think that it helps carry some energy after the cinematic opening nonetheless. Joel Ortiz on Drama, I think is nice. Obviously, I love Black Thought on In the Park. I think that the two of them, it's nice to see the two of them work together. I wish they worked together more, because I think that Ghostface brand of really aggressive style bar spinning pairs well with the methodical deconstructions that happen with Black Thought. Similarly to what happens with an artist like the GZA, I would love to see GZA and Black Thought work together. It's something that I've never really thought about until thinking about this album, but like, that's a discussion for another day. Apollo Kids, which is also in itself a reference to a song from Supreme Clientele, is meant to evoke just a lot of hardcore bar spinning, and I think that like everyone punches at their weight, so to speak, on this project. I really liked that this, I feel like, kind of teased what they did on Wu Massacre with the closer Troublemakers, because it's a really great track with Raekwon and Method Man, and Redman, which he should have been in Wu Massacre the whole time, but I digress. I really like this record. I think that like if you want a solid place to go in the Ghostface Killah discography after dipping your toes in some of the classics, and you want to like get a feel for like Ghostface sort of playing the hits at its strongest, I think that Apollo Kids might be it. Because even a record like 12 Reasons to Die takes that Wu-Tang influence. It does something different. It gives it a narrative framework that I think is super interesting. But I'll be talking about that later on. Apollo Kids is my sixth favorite Ghostface Killah solo album, and it absolutely is a record that I feel like maybe not a good starting point, but definitely a point that you should get to on your pilgrimage through his brand of Wu-Tang nostalgia. Now from here, I'm going to go a handful of years after Apollo Kids to a record that I almost talked about at its 10-year anniversary mark last year, Sour Soul, an album that saw Ghostface Killah sort of keeping in the same world sonically as he was on a record like 12 Reasons to Die, but adding a really nice just spin on it with the collaborations with Bad Bad Not Good, who are the backbeat for this album. And as far as like Ghostface working with a group to create a great pairing, this is like some peak shit, man. Like similarly to what 12 Reasons to Die does, but like without a narrative framework. It's more about mood. And I think what I like about this is that it does give the Sonics rooms to breathe, because there are instrumentals throughout the album that kind of help add a nice, pure elegant injection throughout the both visceral and sort of contemplated and meditative bar spinning that happens on here. What I also like about this is that Ghostface mostly keeps it very 2010s as a whole by bringing a lot of like, not of the time, but artists popping off during that era, and then one awesome MF Doom collab to give us another glimpse into the Doomstarks that never was. I like Ray Gun. I think it's a really choice song. But I also enjoy Danny Brown, Elzai, and Tree's contributions to this. I think that's an interesting smattering of Midwest worship, too. I think that Danny adds a good pairing to Ghostface Aggression. I think Elzai and what Ghostface does on Gun Showers really feels like some next level shit. There's some tracks like Mind Playing Tricks that do feel like they're almost made from the same world as 12 Reasons to Die, but they almost feel like little vignettes within that world because of the sort of haunting melodies that Bad Bad Not Good are playing there. I really enjoy this album. It was one that was just shy, obviously, of my favorite Wu-Tang solo records list, but it was one that almost ended up there because I really enjoy the sonics of this project. I really enjoy where Ghostface lyrically goes and like how he really sort of like branches out in his own ways. He really leans into his love of something that I feel like he caught from working on 12 Reasons to Die, clearly, given he was on some creative shit during this era. But I think that Sour Soul is a really cool project. I kind of wish he worked with Bad Bad Not Good more too, because I think that that's a nice sort of like group that understands Ghostface vibes, and they made some good shit together. I digress, though. Obviously, if you watched my Wu-Tang video, you guys already knew these three were on here, but Iron Man is going to be what rounds out the A tier. I love this album so fucking much. I think it is a wonderful introduction to Ghostface Killah as a solo artist while keeping the group Wu-Tang a core heartbeat throughout this. Something that is, I feel like, a big part of a lot of the Wu-Tang debuts, especially like the solo member debuts outside of Gravediggaz, were really focused around like giving each artist their place, but really having the group dynamic still be a good part of it. And I mean, obviously, that's also showcased because it has like co-starring Capadonna and Raekwon on here, and they do have a prominent piece of this, lending to some of the most highly regarded tracks on here, like Daytona 500 or on Assassination Day, who also has the RZA coming in. They are also what intros the album on the smash Iron Maiden. This record has that same raw appeal of Wu-Tang, but I really like how Ghostface elevates his personality on here and gives that really outlandish aggression a nice funnel on here. I rapped over 260 on my first mixtape. I think that that's a really great instrumental, and I love the storytelling that Ghostface and Raekwon tell on there. Obviously, the Faster Blade and Poisonous Darts and Winter Wars are very much like that Wu-Tang style on 10. Winter Wars is a classic, and the first of what became a trend of quality You God collabs on a Ghostface song. This album is just shy of the S tier, if only because these, even if I've redacted Fish Scale, are a bit more consistent. I like the framework a little bit more around the album itself, and I think that, like, it's just that elevated step up into the best of the best in Ghostface discography. But I will say, if you want a starting point in Ghostface discography, I think Iron Man is that starting point. You know, it has very much the spirit of where you may know him from, but just has more of him to shine. And I think that it is a really great start to his career. Obviously, the immediate follow-up is one that is like an absolute smash, but like I feel like this is a really, really good debut, and I could understand why somebody would put it in the S tier or regard it as one of their favorites. I just think he's really built upon this foundation so very well. Now again, if you've seen my Wu-Tang Clan solo and side project list, the best of those, you would know if by laying out the list that this is my number 3, this is my number 2, and this is my number 1, Ghostface Killah solo albums. Now I will talk about these a little bit, but I've already talked about them in that video and in other forms. I've rapped on the Nutmeg instrumental, for those who don't know. I have reviewed this album and its comic book together, and I did a Redacted on Fish Scale. The Redacted honestly got me more into Fish Scale, because it's an album that I thought was always pretty good, but like the real meat of this record is like quality. And as far as a rapper using skits to actually build a through line through, while it was happening in hip-hop a lot, I really enjoy where Ghostface gets to showcase his love of like gangster movies and stuff on here, with a twist into some like serial storytelling that I think is charming. There's also just a lot of really good songs on here that I kept in my Redacted. I think that like Killah is a classic in my opinion, and it's a really good coke rap song. I think that 9 Milli Bros might be the best Wu-Tang posse cut that's on a non-Wu-Tang project. I think Back Like That is a really good single, and I hate that I didn't hear it more when I was younger, because I think it's got a really good hook. I would have loved that song in high school and put that shit on all the fucking time. Obviously, the pockets of this where MF Doom gets to crop up, I also really, really love, because I just wish that Ghostface and Doom worked more together. But I think that by the by, there are a lot of really good songs on the Fish Scale record that I even cut. Like it's a pretty good record by at the end of the day. And I think that like it may not be the best starting point in Ghostface discography. It is a point that is very much essential in listening to his discography. I feel like as much as Supreme Clientele or 12 Reasons to Die. I feel like if you want a starting point that isn't Iron Man. I think 12 Reasons to Die might be that, because it has that Wu-Tang ephemera, but it's given a concept. It's given a really cool concept, too. Again, read the comic. Read the comic while listening to the instrumentals of the album, because it's really cool to do so. It fits the mood and vibe of the comic. It's just a well put together piece. Like, I think that, like, it is very direct in its storytelling, but it's purposefully so. You know, I could see one taking issue, how it's very just, like, by the numbers in its presentation. It doesn't do anything, like, grand artful with it, but that's what that's for. What the actual, like, bars and stuff feel like they're trying to do is tell the story if you aren't reading the comic book. And I think that the way Ghostface tells the story with the melting pot of Wu-Tang Clan members lends to a project that feels like a classic Wu-Tang style album. I really love 12 Reasons to Die. And I think that it is, like, I feel like the closest any of the members did, outside of No Said Date maybe, at making a solo album that sounds like a Wu-Tang Clan record. That wasn't, like, Cuban Links, fresh out of, like, still stacked with RZA production. Like, this has Adrian Young doing Wu-Tang inspo stuff that still feels like it's within its own spirit. Love this album. Also has a really good You God collab in Blood on the Cobblestones. That's a really fun, like, aggressive posse cut in the middle of the record that acts like a really nice action scene. It's a record that I think people should spin. And that's why I said if you aren't starting with Iron Man, start with 12 Reasons to Die. And then maybe go into Sour Soul and some of the other classics. Like, this is peak, in my opinion. And it's a really cool record, too. And that's why I like it so much. It's just a cool idea that I think isn't done badly. As far as Supreme Clientele, though, it is that record. Like, I've never been one to be like a contrarian against it and say it's the worst. But it's not a record that I've gone to bat for as much as, like, Cuban Links, because I like Cuban Links more. But I think that Supreme Clientele is Ghostface Killah's best album, because it has him really tapping into, like, parts of the hip-hop scene that, like, make sense, considering, like, the Wu-Tang inspo of, like, heavy sampling of old Kung Fu albums, but doing it MF Doom style. Man, I fucking love that shit! And I think that Ghostface does a really good job at making a coke rap album throughout this persona of Tony Starks. It's got classics after classics. Nutmeg into One is just like a great 1-2 combo out the gate that, like, is one of the best in hip hop. I have Cher Shay La Ghost on rotation in my head intermittently every couple of months, because again, it's an iconic You God Ghostface collab. I do think it's interesting that he decided to take two album titles from songs that are right next to each other in the track listing. Ghostdini and Apollo Kids. Apollo Kids, the song, another iconic hip-hop instrumental that is just classic. And again, a reaffirmation of how good Ghost and Ray are together. But Ghostdini is also a really good song. But Apollo Kids is very much like, it's a classic. The moments where it does lean more into the Wu-Tang worship outside of, like, this other, you know, tangent he's trying to go through with, like, Wu Banga 101 or Buck 50, I think blend well with the sauce. It's a record that's stacked in length, but, like, is well worth the investment in listening. If you aren't starting with these two, start with Supreme Clientele. You are starting with the best, and some would say that's not a good idea, but it is really his best album. And if you are, I guess, picking one Ghostface album to listen to, make it Supreme Clientele, because it is just that good. And that's the Ghostface Killah discography, ranked from F to S, worst to best. What are your thoughts? Do you like Ghostface Killah? Do you have a record that you think I've rated too low or too high? Sound off. This video was supposed to come out last week. Did not. That said, the Redacted is going to be dropping next week with the listening log, because I I spent a lot of time listening to Ghostface Killah, and so I was going to give him his time on the channel. Are there any projects you think I should add into this that I chose to omit as well? Let me know that. If you like to give it a like. If you want to see more, consider subscribing. I drop 2 to 4 vids a week depending on what I've got going on. I've got Perfect Dark dropping this weekend. It's recorded. I've just got to edit it. You guys have a good day's life and situations, and I'll see you another day.